So the result of this was not only those insane mortgages, but the insanity of being able to sell them to a bank. You didn't have to worry about whether that customer was any good.
Sure.
That was up to the next guy, and he didn't pay much attention. And the next guy, along with these collateralized debt obligations, played the law of averages that just wasn't going to work given those circumstances. Nobody thought enough about the risk. So what that gave rise to was first huge amounts of spending from equitizing the value of houses. In other words, the economy was pumped up by something like $2 trillion in that period from people taking money out of their houses to spend. Well, you can only do that once. Maybe they thought they could do it more, but those things don't happen like that. And then in the following act shows that you're trying to restore all that, so you're spending $2 trillion less to restore your equity, or you can't keep saving like that. And the other thing that happened was it basically put the financial system under enormous pressure, and one entire industry, banking, basically eliminated all its dividends. This does not happen very often. This was the worst decline in dividends.
And they tend to be large dividend payers on a relative basis.
Yeah, oh yeah, but it took the S&P dividend down about 22%. And if you look at the long chain of S&P dividends, have your students just chart the S&P dividend from 1926, and it goes, that's the Depression, and then it kind of grows and grows and grows. There are little bumps, but this is the biggest bump in dividends since the Depression. And so this was a market collapse that was born by essentially an economic or financial collapse. I mean, collapse might be a little bit strong, but if an industry eliminates its dividend, that is not something that will happen in the marketplace without recognition. So this was a more logical collapse if we'd only seen it coming.
In hindsight, yes.
Yep.
So this kind of begs the question of slippery slope. So there's some examples that you've highlighted that are really egregious, and you're kind of saying that they deserve some action. Now that there's an argument that implies that there's some value added in active management, and so why don't we move on to, I mean, you've spoken in the past. I mean, they're clearly in total, all managers are average, right? But we also, and everybody thinks they're above average, else they wouldn't be doing it, right? That said, we all do know that clearly there's some people that are smarter, more insightful, have more discipline in a process that really has stood the test of time. And maybe not a ton of them, but you've mentioned, well, the most obvious one is Buffett, and you can argue that he's got a few different. His wasn't a mutual fund or some other things, but Dodge and Cox and Longleaf and some others have really done a nice job over a long period of time. So, in The Intelligent Investor, Ben Graham makes this point of, well, most investors should be defensive, right? And essentially, buy and hold and play an index, and you're going to do fantastically well. But, there's also what he calls enterprising investors, where, you're really on top of it, and that there's some meaningful value to be had by being at least somewhat active. And there's some examples that we can look at that have really seemed to be persistent. So, and then of course there's the irony of Buffett and Munger and others that are active managers that are enormously complementary of of index investing and you, which I guess fits into some degree with the defensive versus enterprising investor. But what are your thoughts on that kind of thinking?
Well, first, let me differentiate between the active managers. Let's call them a stock picker. And for each good stock picker, of course, there's a bad stock picker, but no way around these things. And then there's asset allocation. How much do you want in stocks and how much do you want in bonds? To me, that is by and large a buy and hold proposition. Don't do something, just stand there, almost no matter what happens, and maybe no matter what happens. For example, even this 50% decline, you ended up with more money 7 years later, from 2007 to 2014, if you just stayed in and just taken your lumps, and it came back if you were in an all market index fund. So asset allocation is a little different, but there's one thing that is the same. please don't let anybody forget this. If you're smart enough to reduce your allocation to stocks and increase your allocation to bonds, somebody else is reducing their allocation to bonds and increasing their allocation to stocks.
The logic is the same.
In other words, the logic is identical. So if the system is roughly, which it is, depending on how you count the Treasury's debt, which is another interesting story, but roughly a 60-40 situation. So you have the total market allocation for the typical investor, and the variations are not huge. You know, somebody's going to be 100% in equities, which by definition is the best long-term strategy, and yet you may not be able to handle the bumps. Well, let me correct myself. No, 100% equities is not the best long strategy. 100% equities leveraged, 2 to 1.
There you go.
3 to 1, just so long as you get someone to bail you out at the bottom,
Right.
and you can pay them back later. This is not an easy thing to do, but we all know those fundamentals, and we all know the allocation for the system is fixed for all of us. So we're trading back and forth with one another, trying to prove we're smarter. And I'd say this about Warren. You know, when he's, as everybody knows, decided to, in the money he's leaving to his widow in a trust, he has directed it to be invested 90% in the S&P 500 index fund. Not a Vanguard S&P 500 index fund, I should say, because he said it too. And this big bet he has with the hedge fund, which he's winning by a huge amount happily. You know, they're kind of random events. His bet, his side of the bet, is not that Berkshire will do better than the hedge fund, but that the S&P 500 will do better. So he's a huge supporter, and has been for as long as I've known him, of the index fund. And indeed, when I talked to him about Little Book of Common Sense Investing, I said, you know, I'm going to write in the conclusion. I was just working on the book when I had dinner with him. I guess that would be back in around 2006. And I said, I'd concluded that Benjamin Graham would be an indexer. Do you think that's fair? And because everything changed. You know, Benjamin Graham recanted a lot of, it's hard to find value anymore. There are too many people looking for it. And he said, of course he was an indexer fund. I know because he told me so. And that was good enough for me, so I put it in the book. But so these are the verities of investing, that you're going to depart from this universe of stocks and bonds. If you depart, somebody else does the exact opposite thing. It's a closed universe. And so in that sense, and I love this point, it's a little bit difficult to do without a chart, but the chart is entitled, We're All Indexers. Look at the total stock market. That's what we all own. Now slice about a third of that out, and those are indexers who know the value of indexing. So they own an index fund, and with no trading, arguably no trading. Then look at the other 2/3. Those people own the market index by definition, those stockholders. But they're not satisfied with that. They want to bet against each other, and therefore they lose to the index by the amount of transaction costs they have. None of this is complicated. Warren wrote this great piece, which I edited a little bit, for my book, Little Book of Common Sense, about the Gotrocks family.
Yep.
And they were fine as long as they kept to their own devices.
Great.
But when they started thinking they could beat each other, then they started to do worse. And the costs went up, and the taxes went up. And they did worse and worse until they went back to just buy and hold and don't fight over this with each other. These are verities.
So there are studies, Ibbotson and some very credible folks, that look at hedge funds, and even taking away the various biases that the hedge fund indices have, they take those away and they say, well, there's still some stock selection value added on a consistent basis that hedge funds have been able to demonstrate. And even after fees, that they're adding value, and their fees are dramatically higher than your average mutual fund, I believe. So what do you say to those
Well,
stats?
you know, I'm a little bit like the mutual fund industry. Some do for a while. I mean, you know, we can't tell you how they'll do in the future. As I mentioned earlier, the past is not always prologue. But there are some managers who I think will do fine. Seth Klarman would be one. And in the mutual fund industry, I should say this a little more than parenthetically, certainly you identify Longleaf and Dodge & Cox as two of the better firms. So do I. Why? I'm not sure how much better they'll do than anybody else. I doubt they will do a heck of a lot better. But they are investment management professionals and not giant marketing firms. And the mutual fund industry suffers from this tragic flaw of capital flows and size. The better your performance, the bigger you get. And the bigger you get, the harder it is to develop the performance, even leaving aside reversion to the mean. Right. Size is a hazard. And when you get to Warren Buffett, I'm trying to do this, but at some point I am going to do it. Look at his investment portfolio. And it's not going to look anywhere near as good as Berkshire Hathaway's returns because he's got these hugely profitable, extremely well-run reinsurance companies. Sure. And he's got Geico. Sure. So you got to disaggregate to really come to a conclusion. And what he did brilliantly, without any of that, when he was in tiny size, and I don't take any credit away from it at all, but today the ball game is different. The market is more efficient. He's much bigger. If I had to pick a number out of the air, I'd say when you buy Berkshire Hathaway, you're buying probably 75% the insurance business and 25% the portfolio. And that 25% for the portfolio, maybe even a little on the high side. I haven't done the work that I want to do on that. But in any event, it's a mixed thing. So, and he doesn't have the hazards of the mutual fund industry or the costs. I mean, Warren's costs are tiny. And tax efficiency, you know that, yep. Very, very high. So no wonder he and I get along. Cost and tax efficiency and diversification. And it's also, in a kind of an odd way, if you're an active, successful money manager, it's so easy to say to an investor, just buy the index fund. The investor who comes to you and wants help is a human being. You could say, buy Eastman Kodak. Mm-hmm. I was there when I heard one very smart investor say to another seeking advice, he wanted to do a rifle shot. He said, well, do Eastman Kodak. The stock was in at 93. It happens. Right. It I think in bankruptcy here, or near bankruptcy at least, it's probably worth $1 a share or $2. I don't know exactly. But don't take rifle shots. Don't gamble on active management. Don't be sure that your hedge fund today is going to be the hedge fund tomorrow. And don't ignore the fact that about, I think the number is close to 30 or 33% a year of hedge funds go out of business. Yep. And then be careful of averages. When you look at, think about this for a minute. When you look at the mutual fund industry, you don't average stock and bond funds together. You say, here are the returns on bond funds, and here are the returns on stock funds, and over here are the returns on balanced funds. Do that in the hedge fund industry, and you've got such a huge mass of different objectives. They use all these sort of like macro. I'm not quite sure what that means. And maybe there's even a micro. And then there are, commodity hedge funds and a whole lot.
The data is very hard to get to.
Yeah, and then the failure rate is high. Yep. And then what does Bert Malkiel call it? The basically looking back rate. Someone tries a strategy for
bias.
Yeah.
Right.
The strategy worked great for 5 years.
And then we'll put it in the index.
And I remember a friend of mine snuck me a copy. He said, tell him he left it on the train because it was very confidential, of a whole lot of hedge fund managers. And it showed their year-by-year returns, a couple of pages for each firm. And I just went through that book totally arbitrarily and said, here's where they went public. All I did was look at the great returns and the average returns and drew the line. And I was only right in 97% of the cases. So, do hedge funds if you want to. They make a lot more sense for tax-exempt institutions than for taxable because the tax burden is heavy. And then what's going to happen when these managers lose this unconscionable tax exemption they get, or tax conversion from dividend income to capital gains is not going to go on forever. Right. But it's okay. I did yesterday on Bloomberg. I was co-host with Cliff Asness, one of the great hedge fund managers. very successful, the most honest guy in the business, with the possible exception of yours truly. And we got along famously. He's a really good person. He's honest about his shortcomings, and I try and be honest about mine. And I can't tell somebody what kind of a career they should pursue. He takes great pride in saying, you know, Jack Bogle says that this is the least bad hedge fund. He said on television yesterday that we are the least bad hedge fund. I take that as an enormous compliment.
We are at about an hour and 15 minutes in, so we might
Okay.
want to just start wrapping up.
Fair enough. So, what message would you give to my students here that are, in part not looking to get maybe half of them into the investment business, but maybe half of them that are, and potentially want to be, some form of active investor. And so, what advice would you give to folks at this stage in their career in terms of investing? I imagine it'll be pretty clear, but in terms of actually getting into the business, what areas would you say would be an interesting opportunity over time?
Well, let me say a couple of things. One, I don't think it's my province, and I don't want it to be my province, to somebody not to do something they will love to do or believe they would love to do, and to shape their career plans out of my narrow perspectives. They are not going to find being in an index business all that exciting. Indexing, in fact, is boring, and I tell people you'll be bored to death for 70 years. So don't look at your statements. And when you open your last statement after 75 years or 50 years or whatever it is for the first time, you just make sure you've got a good cardiologist around, because you are going to go into you're going to have a heart attack. You're not going to believe there's that much money there. So boring to do, but tremendously rewarding over the long run. So I'm not going to tell people to stay out of active management if they want to do that, if they believe that's their calling. We need a much better active management business, and I would tell them to try and make it better, to work with the kind of firms that are trying to do the best they can for their clients, to be client-centric and not marketing-centric, to be fiduciary-centric, stewardship-centric, and not salesmanship-centric, to be management-centric and not marketing-centric, and to the extent you can, and that's where I give Longleaf and Dodge and Cox a high grades. If you look at their record, sometimes a little better, sometimes a little worse, but they're never going to really let you down, and they're never going to have a hot product. They're distinguished in this industry where the big guys like us maybe have an average of 150 funds, believe that or not, 130 anyway, and they probably run, Dodge and Cox probably runs 6, and Longleaf probably runs 4. I don't know the exact numbers, but they know what they're doing in the business. That does not make them free from error, not make them free from investment mistakes, but you can trust someone who knows his job is to manage your money to the best of his ability or her ability, and not be diverted by trying to catch the next go-go wave.
Sure.
And then look to your strengths. What if you're going to be a security analyst? What industries do you really get your heart going a little pity-pat about? Retail is probably different from technology, and you probably don't have to know quite as much either in retail. If you're looking at the retail industry I'm speaking of here, as compared to technology or healthcare, where all these exciting things are going on, and the outcome is unknown to anybody. And I'd say always be aware of the big picture. Know financial history, and
it's a good start, hopefully, taking this class.
Yeah, know your financial history. Talk to Dick Sillop at NYU about this, and it's the one thing I have tried to do. And I'm no damn paragon, but I am aware of history. I care deeply about history. Again, without claiming or having any expertise at all, but it's nice to know what happened before. It's not so wise to think the same things will happen all over again, but I think it's Mark Twain who said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Indeed.
Something to that thing. So I'd say you're going to find it much more rewarding to live a life of integrity, where maybe you make a little less money or a lot less money, And this is a highly rewarded system right now. If indexing becomes half of it instead of a third of it, that's not going to be so good. But those things will happen or they won't happen. They're without your control. So take responsibility. Work harder than you're expected to. Work longer than you're expected to. Work smarter than you're expected to. And do your best to make sure that whomever you're investing money for you're putting their interests first. It's called fiduciary duty. Kind of forgotten all that. So there's an honorable way to be in this business and a way that is, I don't want to say dishonorable, but I would say less than honorable. Everybody knows a lot of corners are being cut. A lot of information has been thrown around here and there. Stuff is very discreditable to the financial business, and deservedly so. And it hates all these regulations, fights with an awful lot of money to have any regulations go on. But we brought it as an industry on ourselves to be regulated. Regulation doesn't come out of nowhere.
Right.
If somebody punches you in the nose, somebody wants to pass a law that says you may not punch somebody in the nose with impunity at least.
Right.
And so have confidence in the role of capitalism in the world. There is no other way, my opinion. But man, we are a long way from true capitalism in this world. Bring it home.
There you go.
Bring that late lamented capitalism home. Bring it home to the financial field, which is the center core of all this. And have a great career. And if it doesn't work out, try something else.
Very good. Many words of wisdom. Thank you very much for your time, Jack.
My pleasure.
Great. Appreciate it. Okay. That's super.
Oh my God, is it 4 o'clock already?
No.
10
Oh.
Yeah. We didn't go that long. You can't give me that
We'll give you the
you can't
Tony.
give me that 3
We'll
hour
give you
line,
the
right?
Tony